Just a very quick intro. This is J. Scott Marcus, I think the in-house American. And on top of that, someone who'll talk to us this morning about regulation and digital. And bear with us, we all know that regulation is what we do every day in this town, but it's not necessarily the sexiest topic. But we're going to try and make it as sexy as possible by maybe talking about Brexit. I feel like maybe Brexit is the sexiest topic, no. But there is a point to be made that in an era of Euroscepticism that this town and politicians in member states grapple with, play with, use, regulation really underpins transparency and the effectiveness of what the EU does for its citizens. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about what this Commission can do better to bring that sort of front and center in its work.
Okay, when it comes to bringing regulation front and center, I think it potentially plays a really key role in terms of maintaining legitimacy of process. What Maria was just talking about before was the distinction of different missions that the Commission has. One being politically accountable to the voters, the other being administratively or regulatorily responsible, essentially operating within a defined political context, but responsible effectively to the courts. And the Commission has both roles, and keeping them somewhat distinct is important. There are areas like competition law where you really don't want the political process to intervene too much. It inevitably plays a role, but it should be somewhat hands-off, otherwise you undermine the legitimacy of the process. Telecommunications regulation being, I think, another example where you want the politicians arm's length away from things. Now, we are today in an era of Euroscepticism. You talked about the skepticism, the doubts about the bureaucracy. And to me, that skepticism has a certain narrative. And the narrative is about pompous Brussels bureaucrats building their empire, putting one layer of regulation, one layer of law on top of another, and not paying much attention to the burdens that each of those regulations place on firms, on individuals, and on somehow the balance between costs and benefits. So there are processes that can help to address that and can also help to maintain public confidence in the legitimacy of the process. And here we are very much talking about process, not about substance. So what the Commission has been working progressively on for the last 15 or so, 20 years, is something called a better regulation process, where each of the legislative measures that they put forward is supposed to be pretty rigorously analyzed to make sure that it's not more burdensome than necessary, that it doesn't do things that the member states could better do themselves, that the costs don't exceed the benefits. Done properly, it puts some discipline into the process. And all of this is public, but it's not all that well known to the public. And I think there's a communication issue that especially the Commission, but more broadly the European institutions, need to be taking up. Now, the process, it works pretty well for bits of individual legislation. There's really no defined process for broader strategy. The economic analysis could be done better. So there's a lot of areas where it could really be improved. Still, I've done work in many parts of the world, and I would have to say my personal perception is that the European system is among the very best that I've seen, and the OECD also rates it that way.
Well, that's a good message to start the day on. You don't hear that a lot these days. The European system is among the best in the world in something that really matters to people. Thanks so much for this thought, and I'm just going to jump straight across to your other portfolio, which is also fascinating. In the memos that I urge you to read, I know it's quite a sort of the size is kind of, solid, I would say. Don't be discouraged. It's massive fonts, I can attest. Lots of blog quotes, which make it much easier to read, and really very interesting a contribution. So a lot of work has gone into them. Just talking a little bit about digital, it is continuously striking, I think, to people who don't live in Brussels that the European Union remains a taker of technology, a consumer of technology, and in this era of a soaring US and China web and tech industries, the EU is risking finding itself somewhere in between and being a taker rather than a generator of innovation. often lending its best minds and incredibly intelligent people who are born or educated on the continent to the US, mostly, not so much China yet, although it is happening. And there's also a lot of talk about supporting European champions. I want to ask you what sort of the top line of big picture policy advice would be to enable the European Union to be more of a generator of innovation and revenue, indeed, and jobs in the digital space, rather than finding itself in this awkward space between the US and China with implications on geopolitics as well as consumer technology.
Well, I think you put your finger on a really key issue, and I'm sure it's going to be one of the key issues for European policymakers in the coming 5 years, in the coming term. Excuse me. First, the picture for Europe is not quite as bad as some people want to make it. We're very quick to say there's no European Google, there's no European Facebook, there's no European Amazon. It's not quite true, but certainly there isn't a European firm of that scale. But it's equally true that in other technology areas, for example, ones that relate to industrial automation, that Europe does quite well, business-to-business kind of traffic platforms, Europe does well. In areas like 5G, which is a really important area, it would be just as true to say that the United States has no company that can rival Ericsson or Nokia. So it's not that Europe is without strengths, but we're at a difficult time. In an era of globalization and increasing trade war, where the US and China play a key role in technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, Internet of Things, the risk of trade disruptions is very great. And of course, what we saw recently with Huawei really demonstrates trade disruption can be very abrupt and very unpredictable today. So Europe really needs to think carefully about how to maintain a broad enough set of sources of supply and broad enough capabilities. And I think there's several different things that Europe can be doing to make that better. Now, I have to say, if I knew how to create the next European super champion, I wouldn't be here today. I'd be off doing it. But there are things that Europe at policy level can do to make it easier. And those go, I think, first in terms of single market issues, second in terms of venture capital, third I'd flag some attitudinal issues. In terms of single market, there are a number of areas where strengthening the single market would help to aggregate demand across Europe and also to make systems more effective. Again, 5G and spectrum is one of the areas that I deal in. There's agreement on which frequency bands should be used, but it's up to the member states to actually get that stuff assigned to the companies that are going to use it. And some of them will be quick. The Germans have historically been very good on things like this. And some of them will be very slow. And if it's uneven, that creates cross-border issues as well that can be a problem. So the harmonization story is important here, continues to be important. Capital is another issue. Europe has historically been weak on both startups and scale-ups. We've gotten much better on startups in recent years, but we're still weak on scaling companies up to the next level. And that's partly a problem. Europe is very bank-heavy. We're light on equity markets. That's a problem. We're much lighter than North America when it comes to venture capital. I've seen estimates that maybe the disparity is in the range of 5 to 1. It's big. Also, a firm that's trying to move to the next level, if it wants to do an initial public offering, an IPO, they're probably not going to do it in Europe, certainly not in continental Europe. So again, it's an issue, it needs work. Capital Markets Union tried to do something with this, very little actually done. Maybe a last point has to do with attitudes. Entrepreneurship. Many North American entrepreneurs do best on the second or third time around. In Europe, if you fail, you're a failure. So there's an attitude problem there, but there's also a policy problem. Onerous and divergent bankruptcy laws across the member states tie up people, tie up capital for long periods of time, make it difficult for somebody who's fallen off to climb back up onto the bar stool. that needs work.
I think that's a really interesting point. I'm just going to borrow from another anonymous question on Slido. Please keep sending your questions through. You're making my life easier. You're making this conversation much more interesting and much more about what you care about. So just a reminder, on your screens, you'll be seeing how to do that. Go to sli.do, sli.do, and look for BAM19. This is the hashtag for our session today, and just type in your question. There is a question here which kind of touches and springs off what we've been talking about. What will the EU have to change to get back into the game on data, platform industry, cloud, AI, and everything exciting in technology under the sun? But let me just borrow from this question and phrase it this way. Is there a particularly specific corner or area of the market and all these cutting-edge technologies right now that the EU may be particularly well-placed to deliver on in a scalable way that will really sort of, create some momentum?
I think I touched on this in the previous remarks. Probably things that deal with industrial automation,
right.
Business to business, industrial. Industry 4.0. That also includes all about sensors and automation controls. So generally, the Yanks do really well on pure software things. Europe does really well where there's also some sensing or control that's required.